Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for tuning in for our first lesson in our class on the book of Deuteronomy. So, if you've got your Bibles, turn to the book of Deuteronomy. As you can see, I'm not in the auditorium this time. I'm in my office, and that is because something weird was going on with the camera in the auditorium, and until that gets addressed, we won't be able to record or stream anything from the auditorium. So I am in here, and it's not optimal, this setup now, but at least we can do this on my laptop, and we can have our Bible study. So this class is going to be an introduction to the book of Numbers. We won't dive in too much to the text. That'll be starting next week. But like always, it is good to get an idea for the general layout, the structure of a book and its purpose and the circumstances surrounding its being written and the context of how it fits into the Bible as a whole. So let's look at the book of Deuteronomy. At the end of the book of Numbers, which we concluded last class, Israel has trekked through the wilderness for 40 years. And I mentioned last time that it was actually 39 years in the book of Numbers because that first year is from Exodus to the beginning of book of Numbers, and then it's 39 years after the book of Numbers begins. But anyway, the original faithless generation of Israelites, that is, the ones who were taken out of Egypt by the Lord, they have died out. They proved their unfaithfulness. They proved that when push came to shove, they were unwilling to trust in God. When it was time for them to enter the promised land, they did not trust in God to deliver it to them. Instead, they looked at how frighteningly big the Canaanites were, and they said, there's no way we can do this. Let's just turn around. And so God said, you know what? You don't want to go in? You don't want to go in. You will not go in. And instead, that generation would die in the wilderness. Meanwhile, their children would grow up, and once the first generation had all died out, that next generation would be the one to go in and take the promised land as God had commanded. And so, now that the book of Numbers has concluded, the original faithless generation has all died out. They're all gone, except for three people, and that is Joshua and Caleb, who were the two spies that did not bring back a negative, pessimistic report of, no, we can't do this, and Moses. Moses is still alive, really because he needs to train up Joshua. There are notifications coming onto my computer, and I don't appreciate it. Really because he needs to train up Joshua, and he needs to get the nation of Israel ready for entering into the promised land. And that is what the book of Deuteronomy is about. Before they can go, and before Moses dies, he has some final things that he wants to say to them. Thus, the book of Deuteronomy is written. It's the record of Moses' final messages to the Israelite nation, this new generation of Israelites. And in it, Moses explains the Torah, the Pentateuch, we call it. The first 5 books of the Bible. I guess he explains the books of the Bible within the last of the first 5 books of the Bible. That's a little wonky, but yeah, he explains the Torah in the book of Deuteronomy as well. So let's talk about the purpose and then the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. The purpose is plain and simple. He is trying to call Israel to covenant faithfulness to their God, to the Lord. They are about to enter this environment where paganism, polytheism, is the name of the game. And they are going to have to resist the pressures of the nations that will be around them to do the same things that they're doing. And the Canaanites were, according to God, according to the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Numbers and Leviticus, the Canaanites were notoriously ruthless and bad in their pagan practices. They would actually cause their children to have to walk through fire and thus be sacrificed to one of their gods. In fact, we have the archaeological evidence of one of the big metal statues that the Canaanites would worship as one of their gods. One of their gods that was called Moloch, or Molech, Moloch. And the statue is shaped as a figure with two hands sticking out. And it was hollow on the inside, and they would throw firewood in there, and they would light that firewood, and it would burn, or it would heat up the metal structure. It would superheat it. And then they would actually set their children on it and sacrifice their children to this false god. And so God, many occasions in Leviticus and Numbers, and we're going to see in Deuteronomy as well, he expressly forbids human sacrifice. He expressly forbids it. He says, these people are doing this thing, and it never even came into my mind that anyone should do that. It is something so foreign to the heart and mind of God to sacrifice another person to worship God. It's not something that he has ever considered having people do. And so that's the environment that they are going into, that Israel is going into. Once they cross the Jordan, they're going to be surrounded by these people that are going to try to get them to assimilate to their pagan culture. And God says, you must not. God says, you must not allow them to continue that in your midst, even. They must have a zero-tolerance policy for it. And if anyone in Israel suddenly starts to try out these pagan practices, worshiping these false gods, the gods other than the Lord, then there are harsh consequences. And that is one of the main, driving thrusts in the book of Deuteronomy, that they are about to go into this environment that is steeped in paganism. And Moses is calling Israel to keep all of that out of them. Keep all of that on the outside and drive it away from them, and remain faithful to the Lord. And not only remain faithful in that they only worship the Lord, but also remain faithful in that they will need to remember and keep the terms of the covenant that was given to them, that it was given to them on Mount Sinai. That is the second major driving message in the book of Deuteronomy. Faithfulness, not just to God, but also to the terms of his covenant. Some people have this idea that they can be worshipers of God, but not engage in not engage in organized religion. However, the terms of the covenant that God's people have with him involves some organization in this organized religion. You can't be a follower of God without obeying God, and that kind of thing just doesn't work out. Being a follower of God without being a part of the religion which he organized, that doesn't work. And so not only is Israel being called to be faithful and worship only the Lord, but to also keep the terms of the covenant that he made with them at Mount Sinai. So that is the purpose of the book of Deuteronomy. So now let's look at the structure. The book of Deuteronomy, the structure is pretty simple. It has three main parts, and it is quite simply the Moses' opening speech, Moses' second speech, and Moses' closing speech, his last one. And that's pretty much how the book is laid out. There's a short epilogue at the end that tells about Moses' death, and that, of course, has to be written by someone other than Moses. You know, Moses wrote most of the Pentateuch in that he wrote all of it up until the part where it talks about him going and dying. Because obviously you can't write that about yourself. So Moses' opening speech is from chapters 1 through 11, and it begins with the first three chapters telling the story so far. Moses especially highlights Israel's rebellion against God, contrasted with God's constant grace and care for them in the wilderness. That is, you know, we've gone over that in the book of Numbers. We are very familiar with that concept. While they were in the wilderness, Israel seems to have taken every opportunity to show their faithlessness. Meanwhile, God at every turn shows his constant love and grace and care for them. And he did visit his justice on them, but he never turned back on his covenant promises. He visited his justice on them in that that generation died in the wilderness. They did not go into the promised land because they did not trust in God when the time came. But God kept his covenant promises to the people of Israel, to Abraham and Jacob and Isaac. I got Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in that he still was committed on bringing the nation of Israel in, whether it is this generation or the next one. He was still committed to it. Then, from verses 4 through 11, there is a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls upon Israel to be more faithful than their parents were. You know, it's this really bad habit that humans have where we teach our next generation to be exactly like us. And if we do that, we perpetuate all of our problems. Instead, Moses calls upon Israel, this new generation, to be more faithful than their parents were. He reminds them of the Ten Commandments, and the centerpiece of this whole section is this famous passage that is called the Shema. And the Shema is Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. And we'll have an entire class about the Shema because it reveals some very important principles about what it means to follow and obey God. But it reads as such: Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, and with all of your soul, and with all of your might. That is Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, otherwise known as the Shema. Consists of two very important parts, and that is the word hear or listen and the word love. Israel is told to do two things: listen to God and love God. To listen means, well, firstly, to actually hear, right? But it means a lot more than just letting sound waves pass into your ear and that's it. Because to listen also involves that you are going to internalize what is said. And if you actually honestly and truly internalize what God says, then you will obey. Because you recognize who God is and the fact that you should obey him, right? In fact, in Hebrew, there is no word for obey, technically. It is just the word listen, again. And Shema is actually the word for listen or hear. It's also the word for obey. So if you wanted to say, I will obey you, you would say, I will listen to you. I will hear you and obey your words. The second thing they're told to do, of course, is to love God. And we probably all understand that love is more than just an emotion. It does involve an emotion, right? But it also involves a decision-making process. In other words, to love God is to be devoted to God. We are deciding to obey him. We're deciding to listen to him. And so Moses goes on, he says, Israel has the chance, by loving God and obeying his commandments, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. Now this principle, this idea comes from Exodus 19:3, where God said he would make Israel into his treasured possession. You know, all the nations of the world belong to him, but he would make Israel his special treasure. Special treasure. His special people. And they would be a royal priesthood and a holy nation. And the idea of them all being a royal priesthood is that priests mediate between God and man. And so if they are all priests, as they keep the covenant terms that God specified, then they all are going to mediate between the nations and God. They're going to show what God is like to the nations if they keep the commandments that God gave them. To the Lord alone. Worshiping these idols, according to Moses, degrades humanity. And so their worship, their devotion, is to be to the Lord alone, to no one and nothing else. Because while worshiping these idols degrades humanity and leads them to do really horrible things, we've already talked about the human sacrifice things that were going on in Canaan, and I mean there are other places in the world where that was going on and went on for much later. But worshiping the true God, however, has the opposite effect. It brings life, and it brings blessings, and it brings goodness to worship the true God. Instead of degrading humanity, instead of bringing humanity down, worshiping the true God, in fact, lifts humanity up. It raises their state, in both in morality and also benefits that are able to be had here and now. As we have seen before, the laws that Israel was told to follow had very great spiritual significance, symbolic significance, yes, but also a lot of them had health benefits, had very practical significance as well. And so it is not just in the realm of spirituality that Israel would be lifted up because of worshiping the true God, but also in the realm of their society and their physical well-being as well. And so that's the first section, Moses' opening speech. It's a very good collection from him. Now the second one is his second speech. Section 2 is from chapters 12 through 26, and this is a large collection of laws. Of course, given by Moses, he is the one who's speaking. But this is where the book gets its name from. It gets it from this section. The name of the book is, well, Deuteronomy. Say it 5 times fast. But in Greek, it is Deuteronomon. Deuteronomon. Meaning second law. That's where the book of Deuteronomy gets its name. Some of the laws in this section are new, a few of them, but most of them are repeated laws from the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers. And so we get the second law, Deuteronomy. The second time Moses is telling them all of this, because he told it to their parents, now he tells it to them, this new generation of Israel. And this section is divided into a few smaller sections. The first is from chapters 12 through the first part of chapter 6, and it has to do with Israel's worshiping the Lord. There was to be one central temple where one God would be worshipped, that is the true God. Also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. That was a way that Israel showed their devotion to God as well. 1/10 of everyone's produce, whatever they make, was to be given for the temple annually, and another 10th every 3 years was to be given for the poor. So Israelites were expected to save up this 10th, or these 2/10 of whatever they make, and at the appropriate times they were told to donate it, both to the temple. You gotta keep it running, right? You gotta keep the lights on, but also a special donation every 3 years that they would make to the poor. And so it was every Israelite's responsibility to essentially take care of those who are down on their luck, who are poor and begging for food and money and whatever they would need. It was expected that an Israelite, if they are truly devoted to following the commandments of God, they would do this. They would take part in this generosity. Israel was on the cutting edge societally compared to their ancient neighbors. And it was all bound up in their worship of their God, following his commandments as he had told them to. The second little section of this part is the second part of chapter 16 to chapter 18. And this covers the character qualities of Israel's leaders. You see, elders, priests, kings, all of them are placed under the authority of God and his covenant law. God would hold them accountable by sending prophets to call out rebellious leaders. And that is, in fact, what we see throughout the rest of the Old Testament. When Israel's leaders rebel against God, guess who shows up? Prophets. And they call them out. They call out the kings and the priests and the elders, and they accuse them of what they are doing wrong. And sometimes that works. Sometimes, like with King David says, he's accused, he's confronted with a sin, and he says, I have sinned. I have sinned. However, other times, it does not work. It's not that it was not worth doing, but it is that the hardness of these kings' hearts rivaled the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. That's a bit of irony for the narrative of the Bible. Israel's kings start to become as hard of heart as Pharaoh, his heart was. And so this kind of, again, shows how Israel societally was on the cutting edge compared to their ancient neighbors, because with their ancient neighbors, the kings, the priests, they were like a law unto themselves. They didn't have to answer to anybody. There might have been like some interchange of authority and answering to each other, but other than that, no one could hold them accountable if they wanted to do something that they just wanted to do. But in Israel, God held them accountable, and he specified that they needed to have certain character traits, otherwise they were not good kings, not good priests, and they were breaking the law. And, by now we understand what the penalty for breaking the law in Israel was. Then from chapters 19 through 26, there is the matters of civil law and social justice. The civil law covers marriage, family, business, and the legal system, and how it was to protect the widows and the orphans and the immigrants. Yes, I said immigrants. The law that God gave to Israel specifically protected immigrants. That is not something that we do here in America, not really. So when looking at these laws, I want to say real quick, there's some tips about looking at these laws. I have 3 tips for you. One is to remember that these are terms of the Sinai covenant to ancient Israel. And in that, they have a very specific context that we need to remember as we read them. These laws were made so that Israel as a nation could remain holy and a good representation of the Lord. Tip number 2, don't compare them with modern laws and different cultures. Ancient Israel is a completely different culture than modern United States of America. You don't compare them. Compare them instead with that of Israel's contemporaries. You can compare Israel's law with, say, the Code of Hammurabi or other law codes from around that time and around that place. You can see just how, like I said, on the cutting edge Israel was compared to their ancient neighbors. Because there are some practices that would seem like totally barbaric to us, but consider the fact that God is working with what He's got. He's working with what He's got, and what He's got is an ancient Near Eastern nomadic farmer herdsman culture. That's who He's working with, and that is the context of these laws that were given to Israel. Tip number 3. Try to discern the core principle underlying each of the laws. All right? We talked about that a whole lot when we got into the book of Exodus, trying to discern what the underlying principle of each of the laws was, so that we could better come to know the heart and mind of God, because He's the one who gave them these laws, expressing His values. Take a look at how Paul does this when we get to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. This is a passage that a lot of people know. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 8 through 12, "Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, 'You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain.' Is it for the ox that God is concerned? Does He not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope of and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more?" So, of course, this is a context. Paul is talking about sort of, is it not too much for us, Paul and who accompanied him to Corinth? Silas and Luke and Timothy. Is it not too much for us to request that you give us some food, so that we don't starve while working day in and day out for God? Would it not be too much? Of course, Paul points out we waived our right because we didn't want to be a burden to anybody. But even if we hadn't waived our right, would it not have been right to support us with what we need materially so that we can sow spiritually? Of course, he brings up that law from the Old Testament, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain." Why? Wouldn't it be better to not lose some of your grain to this ox's mouth that is eating as it goes? Well, God is saying, if something is going to work for you, like a creature works for your benefit, you let it have the benefits as well. Otherwise, it is an injustice. And Paul takes this and takes the underlying principle of it and applies it to his situation, the church's current situation. That it would have been a great injustice for the church in Corinth to deny Paul the sort of right to say, hey, we need some food, and we've been working among you for a while here. Can you please support us? So that's just an example of this idea to discern the core principle underlying each law, and it can help you apply it to your life. So the final section, section number 3, is Moses' final speech, and then, of course, his death. He dies at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. I'm sorry if you've never read it before. I just kind of spoiled the ending for you, but it's okay. This book has been out for, I'm not going to make that joke, but this is from chapters 27 to chapter 34. That's the last chapter. It starts with a final challenge for Israel to listen to and love the Lord their God. And chapters 27 through 30 are a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel chooses to obey God, then things will go great. There will be lots of divine blessings. It's all good stuff listed. However, if they choose not to listen to God and not obey him, there will be famine, plague, devastation, ultimately exile from the land that God is in the process of giving to them. And Moses takes an aside and lets Israel in on something that is weighing on his heart. You see, he knows that they're going to rebel after he passes away. So he mentions that repentance is always an option. In fact, this is where he makes the famous statement, circumcise your heart. Or in reality, he says, God will circumcise their hearts. And in such, remedy the original problem that humanity faces. What is that original problem? It is, of course, that people want to do it their own way. People want to rebel against God and thus seize autonomy for themselves and make up the rules for themselves. That's what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is all about. It's all about the idea of, I want to have the authority for myself to determine what is good and bad for myself and not have to listen to God. And that is called stubbornness. That is called being stiff-necked, or as Moses puts it, hard of heart. And so he says, when you repent, God will circumcise your hearts. And in the place of this cold, stone, hard heart, you will have a soft heart of flesh instead. That is a heart that can be pricked by the Word of God, and thus you can live by the Word of God, because you'll actually listen to it. And then after this, he forces a decision. It's decision-making time, Israel. Life and good, or death and evil. That is a passage that I have used a lot, right? I present before you today life and good, or death and evil. It is a decision-making time. Then, from chapters 31 through 34, there is a final poem of warning. It's a very good one. We call it the Song of Moses. You ever wonder what we mean when we sing the Song of Moses and the Lamb by and by? Of course, that's mentioned in the book of Revelation, but the Song of Moses is Deuteronomy chapter 32. That's the Song of Moses. And it's all about how God promises to bless Israel. Promises to bless Israel if they remain faithful to him, but if they rebel against him, not good. Not good things will happen. Then he also gives a blessing to all of the tribes. This is in chapter 33, and it echoes Jacob's final blessing upon his sons. That's very intentional. That's at the end of the first book of the Bible, and this is at the end of the final book of the Pentateuch. And then Moses walks up onto a mountain. He sees the promised land. God shows it all to him, and then he dies. And that's the end of the book. And so at the end of Deuteronomy, the Torah, the Pentateuch, comes to a close, and something to note is that all of the major plot tensions of the biblical story so far are set in place and left totally unresolved. When will the descendant of the woman come to defeat evil? That's from Genesis chapter 3. The end of Deuteronomy comes, and he's not there yet. How is God going to rescue the world through Abraham's family? Genesis chapter 12. End of Deuteronomy comes, and that hasn't happened yet. So how's it going to happen? How can a holy God be finally reconciled to a rebellious humanity? That's from Genesis to the book of Numbers. And the end of Deuteronomy comes around, and that hasn't happened yet. We don't know yet. How will God transform the hearts of his people? Deuteronomy chapter 30, circumcising their heart. We don't know yet. The end of Deuteronomy comes around, and we don't know yet. You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, we have the book of Deuteronomy set before us. That is what we will dive into starting next week. And I look forward to getting into the text with you. So I'll see you then. Thank you for joining us this evening, and I hope everyone stays safe and stays healthy. I hope that we can get the camera thing figured out in there so we can start recording in there again. But until then, God bless you all, and have a good night.